Hello all, and thank you for attending. My name is Matthew Mickey, and I'm a student at Riverside City College. I'm excited to show you today that my research topic of choice is Lessons from Seuss, Pushing Past Prejudice. It's about some of Seuss's stories and how we as Californians might learn a thing or two from them. The work that I had decided to source and focus on was the book called The Sneetches and Other Stories by Dr. Seuss. My reason for choosing this topic was that Dr. Seuss was an important part of my childhood, and I wanted to explore some of his other work that goes against some of the more recent public opinions of, Dr. Seuss. Also, he's not necessarily from California, but he lived quite a bit of his life in California. So I consider him a Californian. As a quick overview, The Sneetches and Other Stories is built up of 4 short stories. I decided to focus on 2 of them, specifically The Sneetches and What Was I Scared Of? Mostly due to the content of the stories and ultimately how the characters within them reacted and changed throughout each tale. What Was I Scared Of? Is a story about a frightened narrator who is constantly running from an entirely empty, seemingly sentient pair of pants. In this story, the narrator encounters the pants constantly running away from them in each confrontation. However, near the end of the story, the narrator realizes that the pair of pants was also running away too, and was scared as well. The narrator conquers their fear of the unknown and the prejudice that comes with it by engaging in conversation. The eureka moment is near the end of the story. The narrator realizes that the pair of pants was also frightened too, the whole time, and they eventually become buddies. For The Sneetches, it was first written in 1953 as a short poem in Redbook magazine, Volume 101, Issue 3, with 2 types of Sneetches, those with stars on their bellies and those who were plain-bellied. The star-bellied Sneetches had houses, good food, and were considered the popular and superior Sneetch, while the plain-bellied ones were constantly destitute, miserable, and powerless to do anything. The ending for this was most peculiar, as Dr. Seuss himself states, at the end, "It's a terrible shame, since, other than the stars, every Sneetch is the same." The republished version of 1961 that we all know and love today shows the same conflict, but there are 2 big differences. One is a third party, McBean, who happens to be a capitalist character that operates as a cosmetic surgeon of sorts, removing and adding stars on a Sneetch's belly. He takes, eventually, all of their money until all Sneetches come to a realization that it doesn't matter if they have stars or don't on their bellies. They're all the same, that a Sneetch is a Sneetch. So, what I was really looking to answer was, are there any parallels, allegory, or connection with California's past history within these stories? Does a human equal human really ring true like a Sneetch is a Sneetch? Since prejudice is innate within all animals, humans included, how does the fear of the unknown and prejudice factor into some decision making? Is it possible to conquer these innate fears and feelings like Seuss's characters did? As an overview, here are some examples of 3 different categories that I chose to base my comparisons on. On the left, California, and on the right, the Seussverse. Each setting has within it segregation, pain and suffering, and fear of the unknown. Segregation, we have California schoolchildren and the Sneetches. Since California was the comparison, a focus on Latino, Mexican, and Hispanic students seemed to be the best place to start. For pain and suffering, there is redlining and the capitalistic effects and outcomes of less wealth accumulation and how it sort of affects the cycle of poverty. And the Seussverse, well, it has the Sneetches, they're a bit zonked out after losing all their money and hope. Next, we have the fear of the unknown and the documented white flight, and the anxious narrator evading the pants. Finally, I wanted to see if there is a hopeful future for California when it comes to social relations with all of its people. For California schools, the 1940s were a bit of an odd time for Latino students. For one, they were illegally considered white, even on the national census. However, an odd thing happens, and they were not given the same amount of privileges and rights compared to the other white counterparts. I jokingly coined the term Schrodinger's whiteness, as they are whites, yet not white at the same time, and wholly dependent on the observer. With this in mind, they had an odd status and were eventually segregated and removed from schools. As a result of this situation, then came about Mendez versus Westminster. We have probably all heard of Brown versus Board of Education, but Mendez versus Westminster happens to be the precursor for Brown versus Board, predating it by almost a decade. For the Sneetches, the 1953 version made sense for the context of the time period. The civil rights movement was just budding, and sentiments from not only the public, but Seuss himself were changing. Previously, Seuss had, I guess you could call it somewhat racy books, but he had already came around and grew past his past self. And by the time the first edition came out in 1953, a few scholars have suggested that maybe some minority groups have used the Sneetches, to draw comparisons with their own struggles of allegory and symbolism, from African Americans to Jewish people to homosexual people. Basically, almost every marginalized minority you could think of has drawn parallels with the Sneetches. And with this in mind, it's no coincidence that the second publishing is a bit more of a happy ending, especially when you look at when it was published. It was 1961. So that's when the civil rights movement was really starting to get into force. And by time then, it was already gaining momentum, and many had already felt like those different looking humans in them, they're just like us. As a quick definition, redlining, it's a practice where an institution usually will deny mostly financial services to residents in a particular area, depending on various factors, maybe ethnicity or race, for example. This image is a past map of San Diego. Do you see the red blocks here? Well, those areas where many families were segregated and confined into. The people of these red areas were mostly poor and were predominantly non-white minorities. Now, it kind of depends on what your definition of white is. So, if you consider Italian and Irish and maybe Slavic peoples as white now, back then, not necessarily the case. And those peoples were also in these types of areas. There was also some documented cases of above average income minorities. Specifically, I think it was African American families where they made above average income, and they were not allowed loans into these areas where the nicer houses and lands are. When breaking down California and the Sneetches' core segregation components, both examples show how many decisions and outcomes are directly based on perceived phenotypes, such as, of course, skin color, and how these results can have serious problems, such as staying in lower income areas, and ultimately less happiness and prosperity. Generational wealth is one of the most important things when it comes to evening out the chances that a particular person has in life. For example, a baby born in a poor family, they have less opportunities and means than someone born in a more prosperous one. Well, I figured World War II was a good place to start because it seemed like all the social programs that the government was offering was perfect for this situation. For example, they offered student loans, housing loans, and job programs, so the veterans are basically taken care of. Except if you weren't whites. In many documented cases, specifically non-white veterans, some did get benefits, but by and large, they did not. Especially if you were black. If you were a black veteran, you almost had zero chance. Actually, you basically had a zero chance of getting any benefits at all. In all the research I did, I think it was it was 2 out of 3,000 non-white veterans were approved for housing loans. Now, this statistic and this concept directly contributes to a reduction of generational wealth accumulation, as these social programs were supposed to help spur on the social mobility and gathering wealth as a whole. Unfortunately, these results left many destitute and rather worse off than before the war. With all those injuries and trauma, many veterans had nothing after coming back. In the Sneetches, McBean acts as a similar role to the GI Bill. There is hope on the other side that this is the catalyst for our change. The veterans had the helpful social mobility programs with their service as payment. The Sneetches had the cosmetic surgery services of McBean to change their status on a whim, that being the out group wasn't necessarily a permanent thing anymore. It was as simple as paying for an operation. The subsequent wars that followed World War II, however, expanded upon the GI Bill and slowly allowed minorities to utilize its benefits. And while not immediately like McBean, progress was slow, and it was made through blood, sweat, and tears of those who were drafted and joined the military in hopes for greener pastures, with the ultimate end result being integrated platoons and housing for all back in the United States. When it comes to making money and capitalism, we must always ask ourselves, follow the money and who benefits? At first, the Sneetches are still segregated. However, a third party, McBean, plays both groups off of each other. The result is that McBean not only continues to offer his cosmetic services to the Sneetches, but he's also extending and making the strife between the two groups worse until all their money is exhausted. His true intentions shine at the end of the book when he exclaims, "You can't teach a Sneetch." For California, the Civil War had many wealthy businessmen playing both sides. In some cases, there was a couple of industry leaders, specifically in the banking and gold mine industries, who helped form policy and control California government and directed the army to fight Native Americans in other states. So, using less wealthy white soldiers, they pushed these soldiers into fighting random Native Americans eastward from California, taking their land and resources while sustaining losses and not really even fighting the Confederates in some cases. However, in both cases, a third party is manipulating groups, and ultimately, they're extracting wealth from them, McBean and the businessmen. In What Was I Afraid Of, the narrator is full of prejudice in the form and the result of fear of the unknown, that instead of facing their fears or taking a second to think, the narrator decides to run away each time. While it's kind of a silly scenario, it still rings true with how many will opt to run rather than stay to listen and think. Well, white flight is a well-documented phenomenon which can be put into a simple expression. It's easier to run than stay. Many white Americans in the past and present have fled areas where minorities move in. Reasons for running range from perceived property values declining due to minority neighbors or possible crime increase. When you combine the many multifaceted concepts such as redlining, systemic advantages, and prejudice, it's ultimately a deep-seated fear, regardless if it's rational or irrational, that meeting and accepting different people may cause problems, so it's always easier to run than stay. Studies have shown, however, that white Americans actually prefer to live predominantly in white neighborhoods, not out of antipathy or towards black Americans or non-white Americans, but due to the fear of the liabilities that white Americans associate with integrated neighborhoods. This concept runs parallel to the narrator and Pants, and the white Americans to the upper income minorities who can afford to live in the same neighborhood, that both have something they're afraid of, the unknown. And as both Seuss and the real life example has shown, confronting and getting to know the other party allows for the promotion of empathy, mutual understanding, that we all want to live and let live. And facing the darkness of the unknown is usually best countered by the enlightenment of understanding, with a small glimmer of hope. So California still has a bit of a way to go, but there are some improvements in more recent times. There has been some legislation introduced that aims to help minorities to receive similar social programs that, I guess as an example, the World War II veterans had received, that are helping to increase social mobility and wealth accumulation. Medi-Cal is a good example, where it's mostly targeted towards lower income residents, but since a lot of minorities happen to be lower income, it's a good catch-all. Or SB 826, which makes a company's board to be more inclusive, forcing a company to have at least one female, if I recall correctly, on their board. So, in conclusion, I found a lot of parallels, allegory, and symbolism between California's history and America's as well, and the Sneetches. In fact, there's so many I could only choose these three. It seems that while a Sneetch is a Sneetch, a human is not a human in California or America. Yet. The underlying mechanisms behind why fear is a strong motivator and its effects cause people to do different things. Sometimes running is the best thing to do in some people's minds rather than trying to understand someone or something new instead. When people are treated unfairly for long periods of time without any recourse, eventually there's a catalyst that helps change everything. In some cases, it might be capitalism with someone exploiting another, or it might be a collection of different peoples working towards a single goal to enact some new legislation. I think one of the strongest parts of Seuss as a source was how he took mature and adult concepts and topics and made stories around them so that even a child could comprehend them. And while every animal and human may have prejudice of some kind, regardless if it's benign or actively harmful, it's still possible to push past it, and push past this default state, and move towards something better, just like the Sneetches. So eventually, I think it will be a human is a human, just like a Sneetch is a Sneetch. And that was my presentation. Thank you for watching and listening.